Hello everyone, welcome to the workshop on tracking and weighing for speakers. This originally was a workshop before Belgrade Open, but something went wrong with the recording, so now I'm re-recording the workshop. The basic idea is I'm going to explain to you how to do a judgeship for them by talking about how you can actually make sure that you track the debate, create a good oversight, and also, use that oversight to then weigh your case so that judges know why you should win. So what we're going to exactly discuss is firstly just a bit on tracking, some tracking methods that I personally have used and explain how to use them. Then I'm going to talk about weighing metrics, and I'm going to talk about proving weighing metrics, because sometimes people do know it's like, we have a large group or we have a vulnerable group, but they don't actually give a lot of reasons why you really care about that. So it's very good to make sure that you also prove the weighing metric. This way, it's easier for you to win because now you don't have the judge decide whether they believe your weighing is sufficient or they care about your weighing metrics because you've explained to them why they should care about the weighing metrics. So let's just start with tracking. And I think it's important to talk about the goal. The goal of tracking is to know what is said in debate and know quite exactly what is being said, oftentimes. So there's quite a nuance oftentimes in impacting. There's oftentimes like multiple reasons that are given, and when you're able to track all of the reasons, then you're able to maybe rebut the case. So it's important to know what's being said. But also what's important with that tracking is to also know what you should focus on in the debate. So if you just have a little transcript of the debate, that isn't always going to help you win debate because you also need to know what's the main point that people are trying to talk about, what's the main important thing, for example, in opening half that's happening. So there are two things that you should then use and take into account when you're doing tracking. The first thing is you should try to see what the people prove. This makes it easier for you to focus on particular things. So if you know that, for example, people don't prove they're impacting, then you can highlight this to the judge. You can tell them, hey, they don't do their impacting. We are doing explicit impacting. That's why we are going to win over them. Similarly, it's important to know what the underlying ideas of framings are. So sometimes people, for example, assume in the way they explain things in the examples they use that, for example, the government is quite competent and efficient. However, teams on the other side might also implicitly assume that the government is actually incompetent. But when teams don't make that explicit or not explain why it's the case, if you know that this is happening, you can say that as, for example, a constructive speaker on like member of government, you could be like, OG has this assumption. Oh, has that assumption? No one really proves why it's the case. I'm going to prove why the government is actually going to be efficient, and therefore we're going to win the debate. So it's also important to kind of like not just focus on what's being said actively in debate, but also just focus on what maybe the chorus or what the underlying assumptions are. So I'm going to first talk about some quick and dirty checks that you can do already just during the debate where you're just listening to a speech. Um, the fourth thing is just to ask yourself, how much time do they spend on this, on a specific point, a specific argument, a specific impact, and use this to locate your time accordingly. So if someone spends 5 minutes on one argument and only half a minute on another argument, even though you really, really, really want to rebut the other arguments, that's only half a minute long, because you like don't like it or you think you have a lot of good rebuttal, don't spend too much time on it. Focus on the thing that spend more time on it because that's most likely more explained, more weighed, more impacted, and it's going to stick more into the judge's mind. So, if you want to know what the focus of the debate, do also think about what's the time allocation people spend on it. The second thing is that you should ask yourself is it weight? Because sometimes people just forget to do weighing. So an easy thing that you could use, like, look, they just talk about this impact of maybe vulnerable people. They never explain why they just should care about vulnerable people. So when you're doing your own weighing, you'd be like, they don't do any weighing. That's very implicit. Here's explicit reasons. This is why we then should beat them. Another thing that you should notice is if you're, for example, a first speaker, and there's going to be another speaker after you. So this could be like a member of opposition, you're going to have a government whip. If you're a leader of opposition, you're going to have a DPM. What will be useful for you is if people make mistakes, right? So, for example, they don't do framing or they don't do impacting, pointing out that they don't do it is oftentimes not sufficient. So, like, it's good to track that, but also ask yourself, what would be the easiest point for the DPM or for the whip to focus on after my case or after my rebuttal or, just in general. And then maybe some pre-weighing there, some pre-rebuttal, try to maybe have your case already clash possible things that they might focus on. So again, if you have, for example, a principal point and the principal point is quite well rebutted, then it's unlikely for them to try to rebuild that principal point. But maybe if they have again implicit assumption that the government is efficient, they might try to make it explicit as rebuttal. So I'm going to maybe also try to be explicit in the way why the government is inefficient. So these are kind of like three quick and dirty checks that you can do um, that don't require specific tracking methods. Now, what we're going to do now is just going to give you two tracking structures and explain the strengths and the weaknesses of each of them. And then it's best for you to decide what works for you. I would suggest experimenting with them in like at least one tournament. So a full tournament, use one of these tracking structures and maybe adapt it slightly, but don't completely abandon it. Just for the simple reason, sometimes it doesn't work because of a specific debate, or you just need to get used to it, or you just need to make slight tweaks. And the only way that you know it is via experience. So do try to use them a couple of times. If you don't want to use it for tournaments because you don't go to tournaments that often, maybe just do a couple of spars with them and try to, tinker with it and see what works for you and what doesn't work for you and why. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is the one sheet method. And this is very similar to the judge tracking that I also advise. But the idea is just you don't give a exact play by play, or you don't give a sentence by sentence structure of what people said, but you do have an overall overview. So, for example, someone gives a mechanism for why something is true, you just write that down in 2 to 3 words, maybe. Same for impacts. So if they talk about poor people are being harmed, all this kind of stuff, then you could just say impact poor people. And then, if they do it very well, you can maybe like make a smiley face behind it to show that's very good. Or if there's more details there about like the number of people, you could also write that down. But the idea is to mainly focus just on the offside part, the main idea what they're getting at. Then it's important to also track rebuttal, especially if you are in closing half. So what I then do is in a different color, I track the rebuttal of other teams. So it might be that they say, the government actually isn't efficient for these reasons. And then they give other max and I write it down. And then if someone, again, from the original team responds to the rebuttal that's given, then I'm going to use the original color. So if the original color was blue and then the rebuttal was in black, then I'm going to write the rebuttal to the rebuttal in blue again. This way you kind of like can see where a lot of clutch points are. And it's useful because then you can see where the teams really focus on. Is there maybe another point of rebuttal that I can bring to another part of the argument? But also can I maybe try to outframe this? Because again, if there's going to be a lot of rebuttal back and forth on, for example, framing, most judges are going to have a hard time tracking that exactly. And it's going to be quite messy. And if you try to insert yourself on those points, then it's going to be very hard for you to distinguish what your opening set, what you're saying, all of that kind of stuff. So what I would recommend is, using this also to see where you can maybe try to outframe teams. And if you have your own rebuttal that basically destroys it without dealing with the rebuttal of the rebuttal, that kind of stuff, then what you can do is you can write it down in even another color. So maybe like in pencil, so like in gray or in red, that kind of stuff, to kind of like give yourself a couple of like ideas of rebuttals you could bring. Similar thing you could do is not just rebuttal, but also comments. So if you see that someone doesn't do any weighing, you could also say no weighing, like red, and then you can immediately see that from the case because it just jumps out. Another thing that you can do, and I think it's also quite important, is when you think something is quite well rebutted, what you can do is also just strike it out, either in the same color or in a different color, so you can still maybe like read what the strike that reason was. Because it also shows in the end who's kind of like winning the clash. So if you have like 4 mechanisms in OG and 2 of them are crossed out, and you have 2 reasons for OO, and both of them are crossed out by rebuttal, then you can kind of like see OG is winning on this front because again they have more mechanisms doing, and it gives an immediate oversight of this. So let me maybe show you an example that I made. So this is one of the sheets. You have here OG. OG basically has 3 arguments. The first one is basically about competition being good. The second is something of a principle, the state power principle. And then the third argument is about FDI, which is just like, funding from foreign investors coming in, foreign direct investments. That's what FDI stands for. Opening opposition, for example, has a point about how you're going to protect jobs and something about instability. And this is what I mean with exactly headlines. So, for example, having the competition is good. The first part of the argument is basically explaining why you get more competition. And the thing that they just say is we're going to do this via our model, and I maybe explain the model, but I don't need to know the exact model because I cannot rebut the model. So it doesn't really matter. That's why I say just model. And I'd be like, okay, that's well proven enough. Another one is if you have more innovation, you're basically going to create new companies who can work off that, and that creates even more competition. So it's kind of like if you have competition, it's kind of like it's easier to create more competition. again, this is most likely explained in maybe 2 to 3 sentences. I basically have written this down as innovation, arrow, new companies. Okay. Then the same thing with their weighing, for example, here, I say basically there's none. And in black, I have the rebuttal. So for example, OO rebuts that they have no weighing, or they explicitly state this. Now, similar thing happens with the rebuttal on the O side, or just the case on the O side. So O says, for example, you're going to get more jobs, or you're going to have more stability of jobs, and they're talking about how they're going to do it via tariffs and via government funding, all that kind of stuff. And then the OG response to this is actually there's a problem with corruption and lobbying. Again, in debate, most likely something's said along the lines of, look, if you're going to try to have like a lot of like good government projects, then the problem is oftentimes a lot of the money doesn't actually go to creating jobs, but rather to the oligarchs or people who are overseeing the projects or the companies. And oftentimes there's a lot of like rich people who have a lot of money from that, but it doesn't really trickle down as much. So you can say it's a very ineffective way to do it. So there you could say this is kind of like the rebuttal, but then the way that I write down is corrupt for, or like lobbyist, whatever. So it's one of those things where you kind of like need to learn to kind of like try to remember it. Sometimes what I also do is when they have an example, it's very easy to remember examples of those very illustrative. I just write down, for example, example Panama. I don't know. Then there might be some other things. So they might, for example, respond to these things. I would have written that out blue, and in pencil, I've written down what my opinion is. So given that rebuttal and the fact that there's currently no rebuttal given by OO towards the OG rebuttal, I could just say OO is uncertain. And this is nice because this is something that I can then use as weighing. So I can have on the sheet, I can immediately see OO is uncertain for these reasons. Similarly, I see here that OG has these points about why competition exists or why it's good, but they never have any rebuttal from OO. The main rebuttal that OO is giving is on the principle. And because the main focus is on the principle, it actually isn't, focusing on what I think is a stronger part. And then I can bring my own rebuttal that I have here. So, for example, say actually the competition is not always good because you might have companies flooding the market. If you're going to have a flooding of the market where they're going to have a lot of like cheap prices for goods, and that's going to make companies go bankrupt, and therefore you're going to create monopolies, then go on and explain why monopolies are bad, all the kind of stuff. And I can explain why they don't get access to all of the benefits. And that's what I mean with trying to write in different colors. So if I'm giving an oversight, if I'm explaining the clashes or the opening half, I could be like, OG's main point is this. Here's my rebuttal to this. OO is losing under them for these and these reasons. We're going to do better by just rebutting this case, for example. That is one way that you can use the sheet. Another thing here is, for example, you have CG here, so I would assume that I would be CEO in this case. I could be CG, be writing here. They have all of these things about like framing. They have something about incentives and capacity, but I kind of like see that they're kind of derivative. So what I just write down here is like Lemao just use OG's rebuttal. So my rebuttal to OG is basically also beating CG. And then I could also note, oh, they have no impacts. So that's all very nice. This is the way that I can kind of like use this sheet if I would be a closing opposition, which would be normally sitting here if I would be judging, but I don't need to write down my case on that outside sheet. I know what I'm going to say. So this is basically the idea. Now, what is the strength of this? For me, because it's on one sheet, there's a lot of oversight, and you don't need to go through different papers. And if you write clear enough and small enough, you should be able to get most of the things in there. This just creates a lot for me oversight, and also because of the colors, I can see these things are rebutted, these are not rebutted. This is kind of like what I had the main points be, and this is the way that I can see debate happen. Another thing is it's quite detailed in the sense that I can see quite a lot of the mechanisms explicitly given, and if I remember what was said roughly in debate, then I can overall go to quite some detail about why certain mechanisms work, why certain things are proven, and why not proven. The con is sometimes if you have all of this written down and there's even more rebuttal and even more of these cases, it can be quite overwhelming. And also, again, if it's one of this first half that you're using this method, it might also be the case that you try to write maybe too much down, or you suddenly have like a third, fourth argument that you need to write from OG, but then because you have all of the rebuttal written here, you basically have no space, and it kind of like becomes a bit weird where you go to place it. Then it might become quite overwhelming. And sometimes this just doesn't work for people. People see this, they get overwhelmed, it doesn't work, even if you try to adapt it. There are slight tweaks that you could do, which is one, if you have a bit more experience, that you kind of like know where arguments to be written down, you might be able to write even less down, maybe use one word for a mechanism because you kind of like know what you're going to say. Um, or what you can also do is you might try to number it, for example. So if you know that the most important things to first highlight in closing opposition, why you're going to beat opening opposition, You could say here I'm going to write O1 before OO being uncertain. So I start with OO being uncertain. Here's the reason why. When I see here under, this is the clash. OO never responds to this rebuttal. And then we're going to say, the reason why I'm going to now beat OG and be better than OO is because I'm going to do this rebuttal. And I'm going to write a 2 down here, and I'm going to do the rebuttal towards OG. This makes it easier for you to maybe prioritize, maybe create somewhat of an oversight, especially if you maybe use bright colors. Um, but it might not work for everyone still. Another thing is, it doesn't always help with prioritization in the sense that from this sheet, you're going to need to decide what you think is the most important thing. And it does help because it shows where are people rebutting each other the most. It's showing here where are the biggest gaps because there's a lack of weighing. But now that you have seen all of these gaps, it's not always as clear what you should focus on or what maybe the first thing or the main thing you want to talk about. So you can do it again with like highlighting 1, 2, 3, 4, all that kind of stuff. But it's just something that you should do after also writing all things down, also writing your own rebuttal, also trying to keep oversight of what the rebuttal was. So it might be quite complex for a lot of people. It might therefore be best overall to try to use another method, which is what I would call the block structure method for people who have difficulty knowing when to prioritize. What does it basically do? It basically creates a different kind of blocks in which you're going to have team comparisons and you're going to have clashes that are going to be written down under them. And sometimes it might be a clash on the economy. It might be just on framing, and you're going to write what does OG or OC write the winning on it. So it's just really just focusing more on what you think are clashes. If there isn't any clear clash, in the sense that people aren't debating about the same thing, like the economy, then what you can just really do is like write down what the argument is, write down what the other argument is, and then just focus on the weighing part. So be like, what impact do they bring? Do they weigh it? All that kind of stuff. And here, the main idea is to write the headers of the arguments and then explain shortly why you think one of the team wins either that clash or wins that debate. So, if, for example, one team wins the framing clash, but then maybe loses the weighing clash, you could be like, well, the framing is prior to the weighing, and therefore the main thing I should focus on is the weighing. Um, Also, sometimes you might be making even more like generic words, something that's out impacted, it's got like more will rebutted, all of that kind of stuff. So let me show you how this looks. Let's say again you're CEO in this debate. You have all of these blocks written down. You have, for example, in the upper left, you have OG compared to OO. The other one to the right, you have CG compared to OO. You have CG compared to OG. And you have on the other side closing opposition to OO. And then left under you have OG compared to CO. So let's now start with discussing what's in the blocks. So here, for example, you see that OG00. I basically have two things written down. First thing is on framing, because apparently I think it's very important that you talk about whether the government's overall efficient or inefficient, and kind of like who wins that clash, kind of like wins like an important part of opening half. Another thing is just kind of like impacts. So you have two different impacts that they are talking about, which are kind of like, can happen in emotion. And it's not something that's like it's a trade-off between either one happens or the other one happens. It's kind of like both can happen at the same time. And that's kind of like which impact do I believe is better. So in this case, I just feel like OG is winning. I have that written down with having, it being like a uh, greater sign towards OG than to OO. And same I do with impacts. So I just write it very much just in very basic things down. Sometimes you might want to have a bit more detail here. So you could be more like, OG has a higher level of detail, or they explain why it affects individuals. And therefore, you're going to say they have maybe some severity weighing implicitly, and therefore you think OG outweighs OO. And then you can say we're going to use an explicit weighing metric, which is vulnerability, which is more important for these decisions. Now, as you can see, CG towards OO is not actually as extensive. And I think the reason is quite simple. If I think OG is already beating OO, it might be more important to focus on OG and just what they're doing. And what CG does to OO doesn't really matter that much because if I beat, for example, OG, then I'm already winning that clash. And then, it might just be a strong thing. So then I'm just like, the rebuttal to CG is just what they have. Impacting is kind of like maybe new on CG. But it's not the main thing that I focus on. It's just one of those things where it's maybe important to highlight because sometimes they might bring rebuttal that is new and also harms your case. And that's why you might want to write this down. Another thing that then happens here is CG-OG. So here I say, for example, actually there's no real extension. And because it's kind of like very derivative and maybe you have some new stuff, what I do now is because like there isn't any new case that really happens here, or kind of like new impacting that happens here. I'm just going to write out what the new mechanisms are, or what the mechanisms are in general. So OG has maybe two mechanisms on why the incentive is just a specific way of companies. So they say, the incentive is to not be corrupt because they want the competition to not get a leg by just being corrupt. And therefore they have no incentive to make the government corrupt. And then the second thing being, because they want to make profit, they want to be efficient. CCG basically has a similar mechanism, which is they just don't like corruption and they're much more likely to want to have the free market work, which is, again, just the same point as OG brings, which is why I crossed out. And then the second mechanism they bring that's new is something on the form of like they have incentive to create infrastructure because that means that they have better trade. So they're going to build road to ports, and that's just good. Like that's the incentive that they have. Now, here I do go into detail again. So for the mechanism, then I can be like, okay, and I'm going to rebut maybe OG. I could be like, here are just the main mechanisms I have. And then when I'm rebutting CG, I could be like, look, the only one or two mechanisms that I really need to rebut is just that one. So it's just more kind of like tracking what is new, what's better. And the same thing with capacity written down here. So you have the incentive what CG and OG do, and capacity here. So OG just says you have money, and CG says you have money and experience. So then I'll just write out, cross out money on CG side. So then when I'm CO, I'm just going to talk about what do I think I'm going to weigh on OO. And again, it's just very short. Right now, this is just uncertain. It's not, very much like very clear why the mechanism, how you're going to get violence, for example. These kind of like claim it. And then I could just use this kind of like generic weighing. So I might be like, when I start my speech as a member of opposition, I'd be like, we're going to beat our opening opposition by being more certain because they're quite uncertain because of these and these reasons. And we're going to beat OG, which they're listening to because of these and these reasons. And we're going to beat OG by just disproving their framing. And that's kind of like what I do then in the left plug under. So I'd be like, look, there are main things that are the core things that happens in OG's case. And it's about, companies being good and government being bad, which kind of like is what their case trickles down to. And then I can give a couple of rebuttals that I have here. So for OG, I have like three rebuttals written down. I'm going to write that down here. What might happen is you want to have a separate sheet where you really want to work out in depth how the rebuttal works, because it might not be clear for you where you just have, flooding. Like, what does it mean? For me, it means flooding of markets, leading to low prices, meaning to monopolies being formed, all that kind of stuff. But that, again, is maybe something that you want to write out completely so that you're not forgetting any steps, that you also maybe have an example or maybe some extra framing or extra things you want to do with that rebuttal as well. So then you might, for example, have a hit here like a star or an A or one written down, and you have a sheet where then have the same number, or maybe the same header, and you can just read from that. Again, the main thing here is that you just try to focus on where you think is the most important part, and then just try to really get to the core of that. So what are then the benefits and the negatives of this case or of this structure? Well, the pro is that you kind of like have an oversight that isn't super duper detailed. It says that you're not going to have space to really write out every single mechanism. Or, it's more like forcing yourself to ask, what do I think is the main clash that is happening right now? And then it basically forces you to do more weighing. It's good because it's oftentimes done like poorly or not at all in debates. And therefore, it's useful to actually use it. Second thing is that it focuses on important arguments. So again, this was the same debate that happened. So I don't talk about the principal points on OG because I don't think it's central to the debate. So I don't have it written down. So then I'm less tempted to spend maybe 1 or 2 minutes rebutting a principle that doesn't exist. Another thing happens with cons. The cons are just actually the same thing that are the strengths of the previous structure, which is there's kind of like a lack of detail. So you really need to make sure that you're not missing anything when you're writing things down, because it's not as like big, like it's not as small picture as the other structure happens, the one sheet structure. And it's also maybe a bit more time intensive in the sense that you need to already have an idea of what tends to be the most important thing in the debate, or you already see how things kind of interact. And then you need to think time of that clashes. And then you need to kind of like write down what the think the reasons are that each side gives that are relevant to that specific clash which you think is debate winning. And then you kind of like need to assess why is it debate winning, and kind of like who wins it and why, and all that kind of stuff. So it might be way more time intensive. Now, of course, I'm giving you now kind of two opposite methods. I'm basically said like you have to pick one. Sometimes it's also very much possible to actually combine them. So sometimes when, for example, OG and OO are basically debating one clash, I find that this structure is very good for me to create maybe an oversight of being very exact what the mechanisms are. But then I'll still use this block method and then just have for OGOO just on that one specific clash, just written these things down and then just have a bit more meta comments. The reason being that I can technically do it here as well in this sheet, but as you can see, I have my own rebuttal, I have other things, I have other arguments that are in the way, and therefore, if I want to have more comments written down, if I want to have more things about, they give this reason and this mechanism, but it outweighs the other mechanism given, or it's more likely, it's more plausible, or it happens in cases which are more impactful or going to be more to deal with poor people who are more vulnerable, all that kind of stuff. It's very hard to write all of those nuances down here, which is why I might shift to this one. Or it might be the case that you feel like the main thing that you need to do is not really focus about the specific mechanisms because you just trust like maybe it's a very high quality debate and you know that OG is just going to bring 15 mechanisms and they're going to prove them and they're going to prove them well. So then at that point you'll be like, okay, I'm going to have somewhat of this written down, but actually I'm going to have a separate sheet which is going to be more focused on this and is going to highlight what are the impacting, what is the weighing that they're doing, all that kind of stuff, because the plausibility, the mechanization doesn't really matter as much. So this is maybe a way to use it and a way to combine it. And these are just the way you can just start using this as a speaker. Now, an important thing to talk about here is also what are you going to think about when you are tracking? And this has to do with burdens, because it's not just about what do people exactly say, but it's also what do they prove in the debate. And the only way that you're able to get to what do they prove is by knowing what they're going to say. But it's important to keep questions in mind. And there are often quite some gaps and like generic faults that a lot of people have, which I'm going to highlight now. So, for example, when you have an actor analysis, so they say companies are going to invest, for example, and they're going to create foreign direct investment. The thing that you need to prove for that is one, will they actually have capacity to do this? So, why do companies have the possibility to create infrastructure? Two, why do they actually have the motivation to do so? And this is something that oftentimes people really focus on. Companies have all of these incentives to create infrastructure, and then if you prove they don't have the capacity, the argument doesn't work. So that is one thing that you should focus on. It's like, do people prove both capacity and incentive or motivation? Another thing is, this sometimes happens with narrative debates, is there will be something about there's media or there is something that's happening in society, and then people just immediately make the jump because there is this media, it influences people and they internalize it. So it might be, I don't know, you have I don't know like rom-coms for example, and in those rom-coms you have the stereotype of the lady being like a hardworking person in the city who then moves to the countryside and then meets love the life, all the kind of stuff. And then you could say, this is a narrative or a motivation that actually being a girl boss is bad and that kind of stuff. And then the question is, this is bad because women are less likely to become girl boss or maybe to focus on the work, a career, place on men first, and it's just overall bad. What you then need to do is you do need to explain why do those movies that exist, why is that the specific thing that people internalize? Why are they going to shape their behavior after it? And why is this influencing people on like an emotional level? And why is this also influencing people who might not, want to watch these movies or might not want to opt into these narratives? E.g., if you already think like being a career is just, very important or having a career, then you're less likely to already engage with these kind of movies. These are all kind of like things that are oftentimes left implicit, especially in narrative debates. And therefore, is this something you should also point out? They don't explain why and how people internalize this. Similarly, oftentimes people forget to do uniqueness analysis. So if you look at the previous sheet, one of the reasons that a person says companies are going to be better or have good incentives is because they have the profit incentive and therefore they're going to try to be as efficient as they can. But you could be like, well, governments also want to be efficient. Like they don't want to have so much tax money they're going to spend on projects. Like they want to also make sure that people vote for them again, all that kind of stuff. So another thing oftentimes you can ask is they give these mechanisms, are they actually unique? And these are oftentimes just specific burdens that people tend to forget. These are just questions you can ask yourself. Another thing is sometimes people use examples, but they oftentimes don't, use explain why it is applicable, why it actually links to the motion, why it's unique. But also sometimes what you just ask yourself is, are there maybe any counterexamples that I can think of? So maybe they're talking about party politics and they're talking about how in France something specific happens. And you'd be like, well, this also happened in Germany or in the Netherlands, all that kind of stuff. And then you could say, look, given that they give this example, it's unclear where this actually is linked because in similar cases like Germany and Netherlands, the opposite happened, for example. Again, sometimes if someone has a very empirical or example heavy case, then people, can use these kind of like points to see if they're actually proving the burdens. Same with actually intuition pumps in philosophy or moral arguments, where they basically say, we have this intuition pump of, I don't know, we still force people to wear seatbelts. And it's like, okay, sure, the government regulates people's bodies, but what they can and cannot do. But is there maybe something different in this example? Is there maybe another example where we actually don't say that? So, for example, we still allow people to smoke and to drink alcohol. So it's also like there's a counter example to this. So, especially when you're doing these intuition pumps, it's also good to explain fully why is it applicable, why is this going to be like a very good example, or shows that again there's a shared intuition that we should go for. um and last thing is also weighing. So weighing is also often very much forgotten. So teams now do explaining why something is true, why something is linked to the motion, how it will happen and impacting, and they'll be like this will impact poor people and this will be the intensity of that change. So it will be like they'll have now more money for mortgages, all that kind of stuff, but they don't explain why are poor people the most important actor in this debate. And this often specifically happens with minority extensions or even econ debates where people just say, you're going to create more jobs. And so it's unclear, why do we care more about jobs? Like, why is the jobs the most important thing in debate? Why is it that minorities are the most important people in this group, given that, they are a small group, for example? So also try to ask yourself, do they give any explicit weighing? And if they don't give any explicit weighing, then you can, again, quite actively say to the judge, look, judge, they don't give any explicit weighing. Here's a new weighing metric, which is the amount of people that are going to be heard. Here's why that weighing metric matters, and this is why we should win the debate. Another thing that's important to note is I've given you ideas like how to track, but of course, tracking is different for when you're a constructive speaker than when you're a weighing speaker. So a thing that you should ask yourself is, if you're a constructive speaker, is does it interfere with your arguments? If, for example, someone is talking about, FDI and investment, and your case is also about foreign influence on on a country, then clearly this kind of like FDI or like investment plan might actually, link to your case. That is when you should do the rebuttal. That's when you should track what is the specific mechanism they're going to give, what is the thing they're going to give. If not, then you might just, leave it to be for a second. And similarly, kind of like with the weighing. So if they're, for example, talking about vulnerable people, then you don't need to always, outweigh them by giving like a new metric or explaining why you're going to help vulnerable people. Because apparently, for example, OG already agrees that vulnerable people are the most important thing in this debate. So you say on their metric, we're going to win the debate. So that's what you should focus on. And if you're going to be a weighing speaker, the most important thing you should ask yourself is focus on the most important arguments, which are oftentimes the stronger ones. So there might be some, still some clashes and rebuttal that wasn't done by the constructive speaker that you still need to deal with. That's of course important. But another important thing to keep in mind is that you should focus on what you think are the strongest and most well-explained arguments, because you simply don't have the time to focus on every single argument. It's still good to sometimes just hint at things being underexplained, saying it's unclear why the principle matters, given that this principle also exists, or given that we also do this in this case, for example, like a counter example. But it is one of those things where you should really prioritize on what you think is the biggest clash. And it is why, for example, it might be more useful for you as a weighing speaker to have also a sheet with like blocks ready where you're going to see like the main thing that we're going to win on this clash on is going to be these and these things. This is the weighing I'm going to use. So, weighing metrics. I think now it's a good time for you to maybe pause the video and just ask yourself, which ones do you already know? Okay, if you thought about it, then good. I hope it's going to be very much overlapping with the ones that I am highlighting here. Um, but maybe there are some other stuff that can be linked to it or is different to what I was saying. So what is the thing so that you can focus on? So the first thing is certainty. And this is why it's often very nice to maybe have an oversight sheet, which is just one sheet. Because what you can do is you can look at the case and you can be like, look, here are different aspects of the case, such as how it's linked to the motion or how they get exactly to the impact, which is underbacked. So what you then say is, look, they have all of these things that they don't explain how it exactly happens, which means you as the judge need to insert yourself, which means that you just are less likely to be true. And there's a couple of things you can say. It's not only explanation level, but also how many hoops do you need to go through. So, for example, for FDI to be good, you kind of like need to be interesting to investors. There's investors that need to actually come to your specific country compared to maybe other countries. Then those investors also need to build infrastructure that needs to be good quality, and that infrastructure that also needs to be accessible to people on the ground to get the benefits that they're talking about when it comes to, I don't know, maybe having healthcare and all that kind of stuff. And you can say there's quite a lot of hoops, and along each side it might switch. So, or might not happen. So it might be the case that yes, they originally have some interest in investing in you, but then maybe another country pops off and they're going to leave you. And therefore you don't actually have a complete infrastructure project. It's just, it's not the full extent that they're going to get it. Or again, it might be that they're going to have some infrastructure, but it will be accessible, all of that kind of stuff. So it allows you to not only do explicit rebuttal, but also kind of like shows how there might be different cases that happen differently. Um, Again, also a thing you can do here is for weighing, kind of like using counterexamples. Certainty is very useful when people have undermapped things. Sometimes you can also do it when you're doing an analytical extension, comparing to your opening half, showing where there are gaps and why it's actually very helpful. Um, but I think it's one of those things where because you kind of like need to deal with the reasons given and then give counter reasons and that kind of stuff, it's often one of those things where it is weighing that you can do, but it's also weighing that is quite technical, requires a lot of oversight and very explicit explanation of why and how things interact, which can be useful if it's again one major question, one debate, like one major important question debate is just are you going to get more investment in these countries or not? Then it's definitely worth it. But I think given that it might cost a lot of time, it's also good to actually go to other things that you can weigh, which are maybe a bit easier. So again, cases are certain, but you can also say we happen in these kind of contexts more likely. They happen on those contexts, like different places more likely. And we can weigh ours up even if we are maybe less often because of the maybe number of people affected or the intensity or the duty that we have, all of that kind of stuff. So other weighing metrics can also be used even if you don't win the certainty clash. But I think it's also a very useful tool, especially for extensions to explain analytical extensions to explain why they're better than the opening half. Now, what's the weighing metric that you can also have is like number and intensity. So this is oftentimes the idea that you're going to talk about how people are affected, how deeply this happens, and also maybe how often. So is happening every single day? Is this happening on a very long term? And it's just one of those things where there are maybe three of these things that you could win on. And oftentimes the idea is that if you win on two out of the three of these groups, then you're oftentimes easier to outweigh the others. So if you explain that a lot of people become suddenly very poor, then that means that there's a very deep impact that just have affect a lot of people, even though it might not occur very often. So this might be, for example, about crisis. And then they say, given that this is still winning on two of the three major like weighing metrics, you can kind of like win the debate. And that's also very good to be explicit here. Be like, look, here is why it's a large group of people, and here's why it actually is that this is going to be very deeply impacted. And therefore, we win at least on these two weighing metrics, which just means that we're just very important debate. Another important thing here is if you're talking about intensity, it is very good to start scamming or start illustrating. So when you talk about, for example, poor people being hurt, then it's very easy to talk about people losing their houses, being on the street, being unable to, afford education for the children, feeling like a failure, all of that kind of stuff. So you're kind of like talking about a lot of things that are happening. You're making it very illustrative and you're making it very, very sad. And you're often also going to apply it. So, in crisis, bad things happen, but you basically pick the worst kind of examples and use that as an illustration of the whole group. Another thing that's can be actually quite useful for weighing is more principled argumentation. So duty and that kind of stuff. So the thing is, what you can do is you can explain, for example, that the state has neglected some people, and they're kind of like responsible to help them. And therefore, it's important that the state is going to have a policy that focuses on these people. Now, what is this duty, for example, based on? This can be oftentimes be based on dependence. So again, right, if, for example, children are more dependent on the parents, then parents have a duty to care for the children. But again, if it's a grown adult who's like, and their parents are less likely to have the duty to help that child because again, even though it's their child, it's an adult, so the person will be able to take care of themselves. So it's like an intuition, for example, why the dependence is an important duty. Other things, just power asymmetry. It says that if the state has a lot of power and you're relatively poor, and you're very like, just depend on them, but it's just like a very huge power asymmetry, then that means that you have less opportunity to self-actualize, to actually make the situation better. But if the state does have way more power to actually solve the problem, then they kind of have the duty to do so. E.g., technically, it might be possible for my child to maybe like open a door, for example, um, or like technically bike back from like the school to the house. But it will be very hard. It will be very dangerous. They don't, maybe get lost, all the kind of stuff. Given that they might have the possibility, but they have significantly less power in situations to actually help their case. Me as a parent, I have way better tools and I have way more skills to actually help my child. And therefore, there's a power asymmetry here, and I have a duty to help my child. Again, another intuition that can help here. Another thing you could also talk about is the purpose of a system. So, oftentimes in democracy or policy debate, specifically about laws, people just talk about utilitarianism, talk about, you have a best outcome, most people are happy, all that kind of stuff. But sometimes the systems are in place not to create the best amount of utility, but to create, for example, a sense of justice. So it might be retribution, it might be protecting people by having criminals be in a different place in society. So actually, it is one of those things where you could also say, since this is the purpose of the system, we should put in policies that best fit the system, because this may be the only way that we, for example, create like retribution, or the only way that we create protection from these kind of like criminals. And therefore, you could also say that this is the main thing you should focus on. And that's also ways to wait. And I think, and I hope it's clear that the way I'm talking about these things, it is oftentimes giving a like structural reason. So like, for example, power asymmetry, like you have less ability to really change anything here. Or like there's like, therefore it's intuitive that people who can help should help. Because there's a lot of like negative impacts that are happening. But then you could say not only is it just like very abstract, it's also just an example in which problem. So, for example, parents, children, off. That was a very good example to use. Um, as similarly, kind of like explaining maybe why a state has to do specifically to their citizens. It's because maybe they're most affected by the policy that's happening, and therefore there's a higher level of dependence or a high level of reciprocity. And the idea here is, of course, that when you are doing an action, you should consider the people who are affected most by it more heavily than people who are affected by it less. So again, right? So murdering a homeless person is bad because, specifically for the homeless person, this is going to be very directly impacted. But if there are other people who are indirectly benefited from that, for example, maybe the fact that it's you have less people creating a disturbance to society, or like you don't have people being in your squatting in your house, that kind of stuff. You could be like, they might actually have positive impacts, but because they are further removed of what's happening, they're less important. And these are kind of like all kind of things that show that it's important to not give just structural reason, but also intuitions to show why it's important. And then you can also use this as a weighing metric. So sometimes we just use, this is a principal argument, therefore win the debate. But I think principal argumentation often is strongest to explain who should we care most about. So the reason why we care about vulnerable people like minorities is because of this power asymmetry, because there is a level of dependence here, because there's maybe a direct level of like reciprocity happening in the sense that the policy is most directly affecting these groups of people, and therefore we should focus on these kind of people. So I think that is the best way to use these principal argumentations as a form of weighing. So this immediately leads to like an exercise time. Again, I think it's good to pause the video after I've explained it, and then you can think about yourself what you think is, how to kind of like weigh it. Either you can weigh OG towards CG or CG to OG, whatever you prefer. So like you can do pre-weighing, so you expect CG to bring these arguments if you're OG. So the motion is this house opposes the importance placed on sports and culture, e.g., celebrity culture of athletes, hype around Olympics, etc. OG just says it's a waste of money to spend these Olympic stadia. It doesn't pay itself back. And parents force their children to do sports and push them to be competitive, which leads to physical harm to children. And they are sad because something is pushed onto them. Arguments from CG is standards surrounding sports, e.g., fitness levels, lead to body dysmorphia and are perceived as moral failings of individuals if they are not living up to them. And CG is there's a lack of accountability for athletes, for example, Luis Suarez and racism accusations, abuse being ignored of football players, all of that kind of stuff. Now, pause the video, think of yourself, how would you weigh these different kind of impacts? Okay, here's what I have as an answer. So, when you come, for example, about moral failure and the fact that people feel like they are being not living up to social standards and they're not doing the right thing, you could say it's actually not just about kids compared to OG, but it's also actually a lot of grown-ups. And they can maybe give a lot of structural reasons why it's very hard for people to get into like the fitness standard. So this way, you can just very easily say on the scale of people, it is more important. You could also say moral failure is more proximate to your identity in the sense that, yes, you might not like being forced to do sports, but seeing yourself as a moral failure is something that weighs constantly towards you and is also going to affect the way that you're able to maybe see yourself in relation with friends. You're going to be insecure around them. Maybe you're also going to be maybe more uh, in like uncertain, like you're going to be like more insecure in your job. You're going to be affected in a lot of aspects. So it's also way deeper. And if you also want to talk about maybe the money thing, like it costs a lot of money, you could say seeing yourself as a moral failure is something that happens constantly. Whereas maybe having an opportunity cost where yes, you're spending money on stadium isn't as clear of an impact because it can also be gained in other ways. So you could say that if they don't prove the burden why it's just unique or why it's just super duper harmful to the average person or how this affects the psychology, you could be like, look, we explain why the psychology is affected, and that is way, way more important because it's the most proximate thing to an individual and it's going to affect every single other impact in the debate. Another thing that you could talk about is the accountability of athletes. So here, I think there's interesting principle architecture that you could do. So you could say retribution is one of the most important thing for victims because we have a duty towards them in the sense that there's been a quite huge power asymmetry of times where people or athletes just have a lot of power, a lot of money, and they have been people who have been harmed by them are unable to speak up. Therefore, if this culture would not exist and we'd have more accountability, we're basically getting rid of this power asymmetry and we're helping this. And this is an important duty that we have as a society. Um, all these kind of, but this weighs more than maybe the duties that we have to maybe protect children, because those are more specific to the way parents relate to it. And there's more personal responsibility here. But here, there isn't any other way that these victims can speak up. Again, accountability of athletes is you can say that victims feel constant harm and shame when it's not spoken out against, and therefore maybe more continuous, intense harm. And then you could compare that again to like the same way that we did towards children before, and the same way that we did to the money before. So there's other maybe ways maybe to get it. Like children are maybe other ways also harmed by other standards. It really depends on the way that parents interact with it, which is quite uncertain and often more dependent on the personality of the parent rather than necessarily the culture that exists. So yeah, therefore OG would not be completely debating the debate, or less certain. That's like a way that you can deal with it. Um, so these are kind of like things that you could talk about weighing wise. Of course, you could also do it the other way around, where you could say actually children are the most important thing because oftentimes when you have a bad childhood, that's the moment that affects you for the rest of your life. Then similarly, there's going to be the psychological impacts, which then might harm your way that you interact with your friends, the uncertainty. Maybe you're also going to be more of a dickhead, where you're going to say, if someone gains a bit of weight, like you know, um, you should do more sports like I did when I was younger, or you're going to be like, you should also do more sports in general. So you can be like, there's a lot of ways you can make it either prior, or you could also make similar psychological arguments. But again, it's dependent on the level of analysis that's given within the debate. Okay, I think that is then the most important thing when it comes to the weighing metrics that I just introduced. There are oftentimes other weighing metrics that might exist. I think these are just quite useful ones that you can just use and a good starting point. So, what is then a way to prove a metric? This is not done often enough. People just use a weighing metric like, it harms psychologically, but then I have to explain why it's the most important thing, why the weighing metric is the most important thing. What you can do is you can say that's kind of like based on precedent or intuitions. So, for example, the prosecution of criminals is not done because of the fact that it makes people happier. You could also it's because of retribution they might want to talk about, or the idea that you're also protecting citizens from society again, not just because this leads to more utility, but this is kind of like a duty the state has to kind of like try to protect its citizens that haven't broken the laws and are following the rules. Similarly, what you could do is like explain, for example, why severity is more important. As you could say, we think intuitively it is worse off if one person loses maybe €100 and it's all their savings than if 100 people lose €1 because they're often able to recuperate the loss, it's not that impactful, and therefore we would prefer the one over the other. Similarly, for example, certainty that matters when there's often a very high risk and cost, and there's kind of like an analog that you can have for buying like a phone instead. If you have, online shop, for example, and it costs a lot of money, then you're much more likely to go to maybe some retailers that you trust, and therefore maybe also go to kind of like brands that you trust, compared to maybe going to shadier sites that are like maybe cheaper, or like maybe brands that you've never heard of, you don't know the quality of, because we inherently see that because there's quite a big risk involved, just losing quite a lot of money, it's more important to actually have that certainty there. And sometimes, again, you can also make intuition like how governments interact with maybe creating plans for um, like floods in the Netherlands, where we have quite a lot of dams, we have a lot of like research going in beforehand to make sure that there's a lot of ways that we can get water out, and a lot of like things that we're spending money on. And we're doing that even though there's maybe a lower level of uncertainty, because we think that the risk of having so many people drown, for example, in Amsterdam, because it's very close to the sea, is just so big of a risk that we should really put a lot of money in it. So there's again another way you can show that again we do prioritize this. Kind of like shows a precedent or a revealed preference, sometimes it's called, or an intuition. Um, and again, here's where scamming also becomes quite useful. So you're very much illustrating how intense the harm is for individuals, the more likely it is that you want it to be stopped. So when I'm talking, for example, about the body dysmorphia part, when you are illustrating what it looks like for a person to look in the mirror and not like what they're seeing, or explain with an intense detail what this does to the relationships that exist and the way that you're going to maybe see yourself in the future as like just a worse person in general, then because you're really intensely describing it, and you're really doing it, it is kind of like an implicit way of explaining this is so severe, we should really stop it. That's oftentimes good for most judges, because when they understand the severity of it, they oftentimes are more willing to credit the argumentation. Another thing that you could do is, I think, is more structural reasons. So when it comes to, for example, structural reasons, oftentimes more kind of like duties. So and that's why I think use is a very good way to use a weighing metric. So here is you have the state has a duty to care for all or vulnerable citizens due to the social contract. And therefore it is because the social contract is the legitimacy of the state, is where they get the mandate from. That's why we think we should have policy. That's why I think democracy is the most important thing in general in society. That is why the weighing metric of actually having the large group helped is the best, because then you're basically helping the most people and fulfilling their social contract. Therefore, that's the most important thing. Or you could say, because you oftentimes have a lot of like vulnerable citizens who really need the state, the social contract is more impactful for them because they're either giving up more or they're living in a system that's not benefiting them. Therefore, kind of like contractually, you should be obliged to make it up to them or to minimize the negative impacts that are happening because of the social contract or because of the fact that they're living in the state under this government. And there's another way you can space like a structural reason exists. Another thing that you could just really focus on is like courtrooms. So you could say it's the only place where justice happens in a fair and a structured way. So when it comes to considering things that are happening and policies that we are making, retribution is the most important part because it's the only place where this can happen, and this can happen in a objective way. Other ways are mob justice. Other ways are things where people are maybe going to act differently towards you online, or it might be like indirect impacts of like having been associated with different kinds of people, but you don't really have a possibility to defend yourself. There isn't really a way to maybe do some investigative journalism or some investigations into what exactly happens, and therefore the most important things that here retribution is proportional, and then other impacts can be affected other way. E.g., keeping people who are unsafe from society away from society can be done via other policies, as maybe monitoring individuals who are more likely to commit crimes, or help them with like maybe their socioeconomic status, and therefore they're less likely to commit crimes, all that kind of stuff. So you could say the really most important thing is retribution. And this is like a structural reason because you're oftentimes given like a explanation why the structure should be there on oftentimes principled grounds. So yeah, this is, I think, the last slide. Yeah, it is the last slide. So let me just then give you a conclusion of what we've done so far. So the most important thing when it comes to tracking is to make sure you're both detailed enough to know what's happening with clashes, so that if you need to go into detail about vertical extensions or whatever, you're able to know what mechanism is given. And at the same time, you need to balance it out with making sure that you have an oversight and don't get lost to the details. And there are big picture things you can do, like creating the block sheet, just asking yourself where do people spend the most time. But also, it's important to still try to, if necessary, go into detail about the clashes on where did the weigh? Do they prove the burdens that they're saying? If they're giving mechanisms, are those mechanisms actually going to be unique? If all of these questions are no, they're not fulfilling their burdens, then going into detail why they don't fulfill the burdens is a good way to outweigh them on either uncertainty, but also maybe to directly rebut them. Because you could say they implicitly assume the state has no incentive to be efficient, but here we prove why they do have that incentive. That is why it's important to have tracking, and that's why it's important to have most likely a combination of the one sheet and the block sheet that exists. For weighing metrics, it's very important to ask yourself, what are we going to win on? The weighing metric is going to be a duty, an intensity one, or maybe something on the level of certainty. And then you're going to try to explain explicitly why you're winning on that metric. And then also afterwards explaining why that metric is the most important thing. And intuitions here are important, examples are important, either to illustrate the intensity, but also here principles are very useful to actually explain why one weighing metric is more important than another weighing metric. So yeah, that is the main thing of the video. I hope it's clear. If you have any questions, just let me know in the comments, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.